Good afternoon. Today is January 25th, and this is the Ways and Means Committee. We have three bills in today's hearing, and we are going to start with Delegate Long's two bills. We'll start with House Bill 99, and you are the only witness, so whenever you're ready, Delegate Long, you may begin. I think, Delegate Long, you're muted.
I started out good. Thank you, Madam Chair and Vice Chair and members. For the record, Delegate Bob Long to introduce HB 99 election law, absentee ballot and signature requirement for verification. We amended this bill to remove the verification because another delegate is going to be bringing a verification bill in. We feel is very important, but we wanted to make sure that we had something in the works that we can verify, with absentee ballots that they're, that they're valid. Given what's happened in this country recently, we're so divided and so what's going on, we need to bring our country back together. We need to take all the obstacles away that caused the divisions in this country. I was raised during the Vietnam War. I remember how bad it was then. I remember how bad things had got, and what I have witnessed, the division in this country, in this state. This is why I brought these bills. And I believe that this will help bring us back together to make sure that all our voting is transparent and fraud-free. And, and this is something that a lot of men and women have fought and died for, to make sure that we could have that right to vote and make sure that every vote counted. And that's what this bill is about. And there is exemptions there for military personnel. If they're overseas, they do not have to get a witness. Basically we need accountability, and we need to make sure that our voters feel that every vote counts. And I want to just thank you for that.
Thank you, Delegate Long. I see a question from Delegate Barnes. I do also want to mention for our hearings today, we have Jared Demarinis here and Mary Wagner from the State Board of Elections, if you have questions for them as well. Delegate Barnes, you're on mute.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Bob, I just had a couple of questions. Has there been signs of tampering or something that prompted you to put in this type of legislation?
Yes, there has been. I actually witnessed something on TV which was really disturbing. I witnessed in Baltimore City election, I guess it was a judge, pick up ballots from a election box. There was only one person. He was on TV talking, standing there with a box. That's disturbing. And the thing of it is, can I prove it? No, I cannot. But the thing of it is, perception is reality. People perceive that, what's happened, they perceive that they have no confidence in our voting system. We need to reinstall. We need to make sure that we can restore that, or whatever.
So, from my understanding, so this is more of a prevention to stop something from happening. Is that correct?
Correct, and also to bring people back in to vote. I know that we work hard in this committee to make sure that we get people to come out to vote.
So this kind of reminds me of Delegate Henson bill when she brought in about preventing guns. It was more of a prevention, stopping something from happening. So you're saying that you're requiring signatures of verification to stop something from happening. Is that correct?
To bring more confidence back into our election, to bring more confidence back into our absentee ballots. As you all know, our country, it was divided completely over absentee ballots and what they said did and what said they didn't happen. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm just saying the perception people perceived, what they perceived happened in the last presidential election is reality to them. And I'm just wanting to restore integrity back to our voting, to the voters, and make sure that they come out and vote. I've had many people come up to me and say, Bob, I'm not voting anymore. I don't believe in it because it's fixed, it's rigged. So we need to do whatever we can to make sure that everything's transparent and fair. And that's what this is all about. We don't want to disenfranchise anyone.
Got it. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for the sponsor on this bill? Seeing none, that concludes the testimony on House Bill 99. Moving on to House Bill 113.
Madam Chair, excuse
Oh,
me,
I'm sorry.
my hand kept going up and down. It's not
Okay.
for the sponsor, it is for Mr. Damaris. If in looking at House Bill 99, how do you see this working or application? It seems to be very time consuming, very costly.
Yes, I mean, I think we put some of our impact in the fiscal note. You know, we don't have any of the software for signature verification, which is expensive, and none of the we're not experts in verifying a person's signature through the course of time or, you know, different formats or anything. So, you know, you sign signatures in little tiny boxes electronically and then on paper and everything. So we're definitely not the experts in making sure that that person's the same signature or anything like that. So there would be time training and there would be costs associated with this.
Well, if I might, I actually amended my bill to remove signature verification from the bill because I know there's a separate bill coming out from another delegate. Mine would just require a witness. So I understand what you're saying. We don't, I mean, I think there's 2,600 other states that use the software to verify signatures, but I would like to have this as another way to be able to verify signatures. Instead of having to go through the software and the training and stuff, I thought this might be an easier way to do it, is just have someone witness a signature. And we did amend the bill. I don't know, does everyone have the amendment where we amended pulling out the verification?
I'm not sure. We'll make sure everybody has that. We'll make sure.
Okay, we did remove that because there is another delegate that does have a bill separately by itself about signature verification. And again, I think we all want to make sure that our, you know, that everything is done above board, and we want to encourage people to come back and vote. And like I said, it breaks my heart. People walk up to me every day and say, "Bob, I've been a long time voter. I'm not voting anymore. I have no confidence." And whether that's their reality, because that's how they perceive. And that's what we need to work on, is a perception of our voting system. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the testimony on House Bill 99. Moving on to House Bill 113, Delegate Long, and there are two witnesses. So Delegate Long, whenever you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Delegate Bob Long, I'm here to testify and introduce House Bill 113, election in-person voter proof of identification. This bill would pass, would put it up as referendum and put it on the ballot and let the voters make that choice whether they want to have voter ID or not. I didn't actually do a survey, but we kind of did well, it was kind of a survey. We put something on Facebook and asked, do you believe it? People should have to show voter ID at the polling places. We had over 20,000 comments. And there were a few that said they don't want to see voter suppression, which I don't either. And we can work through that. If it we want to make sure once it goes on the ballot, if it's passed, we'll work through whatever it takes to make sure there's no voter suppression. If anything, if we don't pass this, we're kind of voter suppression the opposite way, because, you know, let the voters make this choice. I know we're going to have on the ballot about legalizing marijuana, which I don't agree with legalizing it, but I will vote for that to be put on the ballot. That's the way it should be. There's 35 states right now that show voter ID. And there's provisions in the ballot that if you show up at the polling place and you don't have voter ID, there's different things. You can even go down as far as casting a provisional ballot. So this is not, you know, we don't want to have any voter suppression whatsoever. We want to encourage, again, people to come out and vote and to bring this state together and this country. I mean, what happened in this country, it broke my heart. I mean, I remember the Vietnam War. I remember when Martin Luther King was killed. I mean, this was bad this time. I mean, to see our state capitol under that kind of siege, and you know, I do believe that if we can pass this and the rest of the country pass voter ID, we can stop a lot of this. And that's, you know, that's why I brought this bill.
Thank you. The next two witnesses will each have 2 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Wayne Adamson whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say I'd like to testify. Testifying in favor of this bill. I believe we need a voter ID requirement in order to help assure that only those who are eligible to vote in Maryland are able to do so. I don't think this bill is the cure-all for all the voter fraud, but I think it's a good start. From personal experience, I can tell you that a sister-in-law of mine who moved out of this state many years ago, but she had her address at my house because she was living on a boat here in Anne Arundel County, and so this was her official address. So all correspondence came through our house. What happened after she left to go to Florida, she and her husband, she continued to get mail from the Board of Elections. I sent this mail back with a notification on there that this person was no longer in the state of Maryland. I can tell you that she continues to get mail here, and I have on multiple occasions sent it back, including the last election. And so it's obvious that these people are not being taken off the rolls. So to me, it's apparent that people could vote in their name illegally. I feel that this is a risk and it certainly gives the lack of confidence in eligible voters that people like this are still on the rolls. The problem extends well beyond such individuals who've moved out of state as far as this type of fraudulent vote that can happen. But I think the requirement for an event identification assures that at least the voter resides in the state at the address indicated.
Thank you. We're gonna have to ask you to wrap up, Mr. Adamson.
Okay. I don't think this is I think this is something that has already been pointed out is in favor of many people, a majority of people, Black, white, Hispanic, are all in favor of ID. And it certainly worked well in other states. And I think that this is something that we should add to the state of Maryland.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Lori Graff for 2 minutes, please.
I did not sign up for this bill. I'm on the next one, 93rd.
Oh, sorry, you're right. Lisa, I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name. You can pronounce it for everyone here.
Thank you. I'm an unfavorable. Is that okay?
Yes, yep. Mhm.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lisa Klingenmeyer. I'm here today representing Marylanders Against Poverty, a coalition of service providers, faith communities, and advocacy groups that works on policies and programs that address and end poverty. We're here today in strong opposition of this bill, as we are every year there is a voter ID bill, because it's unnecessary and it puts up an undue burden in front of the constitutional right to vote. Marylanders Against Poverty is a coalition of service providers. We work every day with low-income Marylanders from marginalized backgrounds, and I can tell you many of them struggle to obtain identification. I'm a social worker by training. I do casework. I've done casework with people experiencing homelessness, and it is extraordinarily difficult to get identification. Even things like utility bills or bank statements, many folks in poverty don't have these things. They are unbanked, and even if I could get someone an ID today, it doesn't mean that they would have it on the day of the election, because it can get stolen, it could get lost, it could deteriorate in the elements if they're living their life outside. When I talked and worked with people experiencing homelessness, they would often reference how voting was the one thing that felt like they connected to their community. They were part of our democracy. So if we're going to put any burden in front of that, it has to meet the highest level of scrutiny, and this bill does not. There are numerous studies that there is no widespread voter fraud, especially in-person voter fraud, where this legislation would actually make a difference. This is a solution looking for a problem. And this bill in particular is a constitutional amendment. There are only 2 states in the entire country that have voter ID enacted through a constitutional amendment. And North Carolina was a 3rd state, but theirs was just ruled unconstitutional and is not in effect. If this bill was enacted as a constitutional amendment, and then we did find there was disenfranchisement, we'd have to re-amend our constitution to fix it. So we strongly oppose this legislation. We thank you for your time and urge an unfavorable report.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm going to ask the first question, then I see two others. But I'll call you like my kids call folks by their first name, but they put Mr. or Mrs. Miss. I'll say Miss Lisa because I don't want to butcher your name. Have you found in your work that voter identification affects certain populations negatively? And if so, what are those populations?
Absolutely. And not only for my own work, but research also shows that this bill would disproportionately impact women, individuals fleeing intimate partner violence, folks with a disability, older adults, Black and Brown Marylanders, essentially the folks who are disproportionately likely to experience homelessness, but also be disproportionately likely to not have the ID needed in order to vote.
Thank you. I see Delegate Buckle and then Delegate Griffiths. Delegate Buckle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I did have a question for the, I don't want to mistake your name either. I don't want to call you by your first name, but the woman who just testified. You mentioned that in the work that you do, it's difficult for certain populations, particularly some homeless populations, to secure identification, photo identification that I would assume they could use in a wide variety of contexts in which it's required. Do you think that, and I'm not saying that maybe this particular bill provides for this or doesn't provide for that, but if we had a system where we said, hey, someone wants to go register to vote, they may be homeless or they may be down on their luck in a disadvantaged situation where they don't have a traditional driver's license or other photo identification. And we provide them an opportunity that when they go to register to vote, the state will actually pay for and provide them with a photo ID, not just that they can use to vote, but that they can use for whatever other purposes. Wouldn't that help them in life if you were registering someone that was homeless from that community to say, hey, you have the right to participate in our system. We're going to register you to vote. And when we do that, the state, free of charge to you with no administrative burdens, we're going to get you a photo ID that we're going to give you that you can use, in whatever context you need for the coming years. Would that be helpful to those populations to have that?
I mean, I think if the intent of the legislation or the intent of the General Assembly is to make sure that we are getting free and affordable and low barrier identification for folks experiencing homelessness, that would be a great standalone bill. And I'm sure Marylanders Against Poverty would happily support any effort to get more identification for folks who are struggling to obtain it. But we would not support that as a part of being able to vote.
Okay, so you think it would be good to get them the identification, but you don't think that they should have to display the identification in connection with their voting. Is that fair?
So no, obtaining identification is extraordinarily difficult. In order to get a state ID in Maryland, you need a social security card and a birth certificate. In order to get a social security card, you need a birth certificate and ID. In order to get a birth certificate, you need a social security card and ID. So most of the folks we work with cannot even get the first piece to get the other pieces. Right. So in order to get that by election day would be, it's extremely difficult. And so any legislation that would be helping get folks' ID is great, but not something that is tied to voting.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Griffith, then I see Delegate Jones. Delegate Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, ma'am. Sorry, I don't want to butcher your last name either. Listen, I get Griffin and Griffiths all the time. And mine's, relatively easy, so I get it. You were talking about the data supporting that certain marginalized communities have a hard time getting ID, therefore they'd be disenfranchised to vote. So obviously that's going to be data driven. So how many individuals have you encountered, you're obviously recording this, that would not be able to vote if we had a voter ID law?
I mean, several. I don't do casework right now. I'm a full-time lobbyist, but before I did this work, I did casework with people experiencing homelessness. Part of my job was securing ID, and that was the bulk of my work. And it was so difficult because, like I mentioned, once someone attained ID today, the folks I worked with were living outside. They were living in shelters where their belongings were stolen. They were lost. They deteriorated in the elements. They might get arrested and have it thrown away because they were living their private lives in a public space, and that often encountered them with the criminal justice system. So easily half my job when I was doing casework was helping folks get ID. So several folks, if an election was held tomorrow and an ID was needed, there'd be several folks. I couldn't give you an exact number, but I can tell you there's estimates of 30 to 50,000 people experience homelessness annually in Maryland. And I'm sure they have at some point lost or had their ID misplaced. And so I think there are many folks who would not be able to vote with a law like this.
I mean, so several is what we can definitively say. And in the greater population, do we have an idea of how many registered voters in the state of Maryland do not have an ID?
I don't know if we have that data in Maryland specifically. I think we have data kind of nationally that shows about 11% of the population generally may or may not have the ID required to vote at any given time. I think it's something like 21 million people across the United States. I don't know if that analysis has been done in Maryland. I haven't seen any data to that. So it's just sort of if Maryland mirrors sort of nationally what the experience is.
I just want to make sure as we're looking at these things to, have free, fair, and easy access to voting, that we're doing it based upon actual data. And I want to be careful that we're not using our own preconceived notions and our own feelings in looking at this legislation. So thank you very much for your time.
Delegate Jones.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Ms. Klingenmeyer, could you expand, my colleague, Mr. Buckle, said catch-22, and I'd really like for you, for the record, you mentioned a long list of those who would disproportionately affect. One of those was women and those fleeing violence. Could you please expand or just drill down for the record how this disproportionately affects women fleeing violence?
Certainly. I mean, when someone is in an intimate partner violence situation and the opportunity arises for them to get away from that situation, they often don't have the time to make sure they are grabbing all of the things they might be able to grab. So there are women who are fleeing traumatic situations when they are able to, and in the instances they might not have their birth certificate, the social security card, their ID, and then to obtain all of those things without having to re-traumatize and re-interact with their abuser is extraordinarily difficult. So there are many instances where victims of intimate partner violence are essentially starting their lives all over again and are having to re-obtain all that identification.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Delegate.
Yes, ma'am. And there is a provision in the ballot, a provision in the bill that says that if they do not have ID, that they can vote provisional. We do not want to exclude anyone from voting. If anything, we want to include people from voting. And I understand some people won't have voter ID. I understand, like Ms. Lisa was talking about, homeless people don't have ID, but they could still, under this bill, can still vote. And this is a constitutional amendment that we're asking the voters to make this choice. I think we should put it on the ballot, let them make that choice. If the voters do not want it, then they'll vote it down. If they do want it, then they'll pass it. And once it passes, if we see problems with the bill, then we'll deal with whatever we need to. This committee has dealt with a lot of things. I remember back in 2010, when I ran, I lost by 500 votes. One school took me out, and that was back when they had just the little chips, little computer chips they loaded in the back of machines. Well, and what did the state of Maryland do? They stepped up to the plate and they changed it. Now we have paper ballots, so there's no shenanigans can go on. Maryland has always stepped up to the plate and did what was right. And I believe this is a first step of doing what's right to bring this country back together. Like I said, because we're divided. And, the Bible clearly states a house divided will not stand. And our democracy is in a very fragile state right now. And we need to do whatever we can, not only in this state, but in this country, to bring us back together, because we're going to go through some tough times. We're going through tough times now. And I just think this would be one thing that we can do to help bring us all back together as one, as Americans, not the divisions taking place right now.
I see Delegate Ebersol has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So creating barriers can also discourage people from voting. Mr. Demarinis, can I ask you a question, please? With Madam Chair's permission? Thanks. So can you describe what the average process would be when someone arrives at an election place, polling place, realizes they don't have everything that they were required to have, and then has to cast a provisional ballot? Can you talk about what that process would be like? Because I'd like to get an idea of how difficult that is and how it might put someone off.
Well, at that point there, as you were correct, they would not, if they failed to bring ID or whatever the requirements are based upon this constitutional amendment, they would be then cast a provisional ballot. They would then have to supply that information to the local boards at the local boards before the end of the provisional ballot canvass in order for it to count. So whatever requirements that are necessary for the voter ID bill, which is not, spelled out here. This is just a constitutional amendment. So there would be another piece of legislation that would be following that those requirements would then be, I would say, on the voter to then supply to the local boards afterwards. And they would have to get transportation to the local board facility in a short period of time after election day in order for their vote to count.
I wonder if even local boards are all located near public transportation. Do you have any sense? If some probably are, but I'm wondering if they all are.
I can't give you a definitive answer on that there. I don't think all of them are near that, but I can't say which ones are.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It was mostly rhetorical. Thank you very much.
I understand.
Cheers.
If I may, Madam Chair.
Yes, Delegate.
Provisional ballots, aren't they counted just like regular ballots, or just done in a different manner and in a different time frame? Am I correct? It's still a ballot. It's just provisional. Am I correct? And they're only used if election becomes real close. Am I correct in my analogy?
No.
Okay.
I mean, provisional ballots are counted just like absentee ballots or mail-in ballots are counted. It's not just if the election is close. We count every vote. So that's one of the biggest misnomers out there. Every vote that is cast, it gets counted. And provisional ballots means at the time when an individual walks into the polling place, there was an issue with their voter registration, or they had to, or there was an issue with their address, and that they had to then basically cure that at a later point with some sort of, that they've moved or they're no longer registered at that place. So that's where provisional ballots count. And additionally, provisional ballots can be counted partially so that if, for example, you're eligible to vote for a governor, a comptroller, the statewide offices, but you end up in the wrong polling place, the local ones that may not be counted, but you would still count the ones that you're eligible for. So, but just once again, to reiterate, like every vote counts if it's
Right.
been counted.
So provisional ballots no different than an absentee ballot. Am I correct?
They're different because there's a different process. They're canvassed at a different time.
Right.
And like I said, there could be because an individual ended up in the wrong precinct and you was not eligible to vote that full ballot because they moved. There's reasons why an individual was having to cast a provisional ballot, but they do get processed and canvassed just like every other ballot.
Thank you.
Okay.
I see Delegate Jones and then Delegate Ebersol. Delegate Jones?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I had a question for Mr. Demarinis, if I may, please. Mr. Demarinis, we heard the reasons for this bill for shenanigans and so forth. Could you please speak to is there any evidence to the last election that Maryland held? Was there any mishandling? Was there any audits, evidence of concerns that you could speak to, please?
Oh, I guess it's kind of a little bit of an open-ended question, and if you don't mind, if I can rephrase it, are you saying like, was there any like issues with like prosecutions for double voting or in that front there, then that's more the state prosecutor's office. And I don't believe that there was any prosecutions that the state prosecutor went after under double voting or vote fraud areas. Or I guess I would say, what is it? Impersonating another person to vote as well. I mean, because the other part too, you were mentioning audits, in which we do audits, and we have all sorts of, to make sure that the vote is verified. So if that's the first part, that's where, then that's my answer.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you for a second bite at the apple, Madam Chair. We got into provisional a little bit, and I think I heard someone say that isn't provisional the same as a mail-in ballot. And I would ask Mr. Demarinis, wouldn't a significant difference be that a mail-in ballot, once it's opened and somebody looks at the signature and they've done the things on it, it's counted. A provisional ballot, there's no guarantee it's going to be counted until someone visits and completes whatever it is that they didn't do originally. So it's possible that wouldn't be counted if the person didn't take their second bite at the apple, as it were.
That is correct. Right. I mean, provisional ballot, there was an issue. Like I said, it can be rejected. It can be counted in part. It can be counted in full. There's a process that goes through it. So there is a distinction between a mail-in / absentee ballot and a provisional ballot.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Jared. I appreciate that.
Are there any further questions?
Madam Chair, if I might.
Go ahead, Delegate Long.
I just want to thank you for this opportunity to bring this bill before this committee. Again, I've said this several times, perception is reality. And the people that I have talked to that are just mistrust the voting, the way it's taken place, are, I believe, are being, I just want to say that they perceive that the voting, the way our voting system works is not valid. So, we're trying to bring back the voters to vote. And that's what this is all about, to make sure that we overcome this perception and what's happened in the state, and this country, the division in this country. And I think this is a simple way to do that, is to bring integrity, make sure that there's pure integrity in our voting system. And I would thank you for that. And, I'm looking forward to a more rigorous, conversation about this. And again, it's up to the voters. We want to put it up and let the voters make that choice. And that's what we're here to do, is make sure the voters have a voice. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Delegate Long. And that concludes the testimony on House Bill 113. Now I would like to call up my district mate from the wonderful District 13 in Howard County, Delegate Jen Terrassa, on House Bill 93. Delegate Terrassa, thank you for your patience. I know we had you going first, but we had to move some things around for Delegate Long, so I appreciate you being patient. And whenever you're ready, you can begin. And I know there are 6 witnesses after you who will have 2 minutes each, but you can begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair Atterbury, Vice Chair Washington, and members of the Ways and Means Committee. I'm excited to be here in front of Chair Atterbury, my seatmate, my district mate. For the record, I'm Delegate Jen Terrassa, and I'm presenting HB 93, which brings transparency to campaign financing at the local level. So what does HB 93 do? HB 93 requires that candidates running for office in municipalities and large common ownership communities, that is HOAs, co-ops, condominiums, to report who contributed to the campaign and how much, as well as what they spent their money on. And just like the rest of us who run for state office or county office, it applies to large common ownership communities. Again, HOAs, co-ops, and condos, those are known as COCs. So if I say COCs, that's what I'm talking about, with 2,000 or more lots. And it also applies to municipalities. Quick note, as drafted, my bill says municipalities with 5,000 or more people, but it came to my attention, and I thank MML for letting me know this, that there is a constitutional issue with distinguishing between municipalities with more or less than a certain number of people in them. So I have an amendment to make this apply to all municipalities. So how does it work? HB 93 sets up two pathways for this reporting. First, a municipality or a COC can set up its own process for campaign finance disclosure, which can be as simple or as complicated as the locality chooses. Or if they choose not to, then the candidate for office in those places would have to follow the state campaign financing laws. And as you know, the state system can be a little complicated. It requires them to set up a campaign committee, find a treasurer, open a bank account, and follow the state's reporting system. The state system might seem complicated for local races if the typical candidate only raises 200, 500, or even 1,000, but might make more sense if they're running a 1,000 or maybe a $5,000 campaign. The intent of this bill, though, is for those smaller campaigns in maybe what you'd find in a COC would be to allow them to set up something pretty simple. So maybe they set up a form, like one form where you list your donors and donations, one form where you list expenditures. It could be even as simple as a notebook piece of paper with donations and another notebook piece of paper with expenditures. And the way HB 93 is set up, the local government is in control and has the ability to set up different rules for larger and smaller people who get smaller or larger amounts of donations. So somebody, say, over $1,000 in donations might have to follow a more complex system, and under 1,000 might just have to do what I just talked about. Or they can do a hybrid system that, let's say, folks with under 1,000 follow their simple system, and over 1,000 they can work with the state system. Essentially, locals have the option to do this as simple or as complex as they want. And so HB 93 is basically about transparency, as the government has an interest in, and government has an interest in this for many reasons, including making sure informed voters are able to participate in democracy. Members of this committee know the importance of this type of transparency in your own elections because you've just finished filing your own campaign finance reports. So why expand this to municipalities? As you know, municipalities run everything from local police departments, yes, local police departments and fire, to transportation, public works, recreation parks, planning and zoning, and many even own land. Municipal officials and their employees negotiate and decide large municipal contracts. Currently, there is no Maryland law requiring reporting of campaign financing in municipalities, with the exception, of course, of Baltimore City, which, as you know, is treated as the other 23 counties. Some municipalities have their own regulations under Maryland law. If they do, the candidates have to send a copy to the state so that all the reports can be found in one place. However, only 12 out of 153 municipalities in Maryland require candidates to file campaign finance reports. And I listed those in my written testimony. As amended, this bill would provide this type of transparency to voters in the other 104 municipalities and require candidates on the local level to report donations and expenditures, just like anybody else running for office. So you might be wondering, why did I include COCs in this? Why would anybody want to contribute to a candidate running for election in a common ownership community? And from my experience as an HOA president, as a member of our larger HOA known as a village in Columbia, as a county council member, a member of Housing Real Property, I can tell you COCs do a lot of important things. Notably, larger COCs own land, manage large contracts. In some cases, they even have large security forces. However, I didn't really expect to see a lot of money being put into one of these elections. In fact, my experience has been usually people spend no money, or maybe 50 or up to 500. In fact, when I ran, I didn't spend any money and I won with 178 votes. Others tell me they've bought a pack of pencils and handed that out at grocery stores. So that's sort of what you kind of typically think. However, last year it became clear that there was a lot more money involved in the local races in Columbia, in a large HOA, where there's I heard accounts of maybe $50,000 or $100,000 being put into it. I can't give you an exact dollar amount because there's no reporting system. However, I can tell you, I personally received 4 fancy mailers in the mail. In my area, I know some other areas received up to 6 mailers. You guys know the expense and what it costs to mail a whole area. That's a huge jump in COC elections, and I believe that highlights the need for this kind of reporting. Some argue they don't need this because it's never been an issue, but the problem is you won't know it's a problem until it is. And once you see the money coming into a local election and you don't have a requirement in place, it might be too late. HB 93 makes sure that the candidates in those municipalities and larger HOAs report who's contributing to them and what they're spending their money on, just like the rest of us. It's all about transparency. And I want to say really quickly, just in response to some of the testimony that you may see, I really appreciate MML supporting this with amendments. I don't want to speak for them, but my understanding is they're supporting with, they would like there to be a minimum amount of donations before somebody would have to file. And I support that in concept. I think 25,000 is too much. I think at 25,000, you could really run a pretty big race before you get to 25,000, especially in a city with 500 or 1,000 people, or an HOA with 2,000 people. I want to note really quickly, some people have said this legislation looks complex. I know you guys know how to read legislation, but it's because it's in all the different sections. For HOAs has a section, condos have a section, co-ops and cities, those are all in different sections of code. So it's just the same thing repeating itself. And then the last thing I really wanted to quickly address, I know I've been speaking for a long time, but I understand that the AG's office wrote in with some concerns, but I wanted to let you know that when I started this process, I did talk to the AG's office and I sought a letter of advice from the AG's office on the constitutionality of it as it relates to the common ownership communities. And the first letter I received, I was assured that it was constitutional so long as there was a substantial relation between the disclosure and a sufficiently important governmental interest. And the disclosure requirement is narrowly tailored to that interest. So after the LR, I got the LR back and I said, okay, let's get another opinion. So I got a second letter from the AG's office in which they confirmed the same thing. And they noted that the state also regulates political organizations which are not governmental entities, and gave me no indication that there was any concern about this legislation. So I just want to say there are, this is pretty narrowly tailored, even though it's a long piece of legislation. It's about transparency and protecting the rights of residents in those communities to meaningfully choose their representatives. COCs often function much the way cities do, as I noted, and really have an impact of those living within their borders, including running rec and parks, doing roads and stormwater management, other infrastructure, and sometimes doing their own security. And they even own land. So for these reasons, I urge a favorable report and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Delegate Terrassa. We have a couple questions, but we're going to get through your panel first. So everyone else will have 2 minutes. Nina Basu.
Good afternoon to the chairperson, vice chairperson, and to the committee. Thank you for letting me testify here today. My name is Nina Basu. I chair the Long Reach Village Board, which is one of the 10 component villages of Columbia, Maryland, one of the larger homeowners associations here in Maryland. We consist of almost 6,000 units, almost 17,000 residents in Columbia. The Long Reach Village Board voted to support HB 93 requiring disclosures of funding sources as well as expenditures for our village elections. Every 2 years, we elect our village representatives and a representative to the Columbia Council. All of these are volunteer positions, but volunteer positions with certain requirements. And we may be a small volunteer organization in the grand scheme of things, but the villages actually do have a significant amount of power and authority outside of just deciding what color your door can be painted. Instead, the villages and especially Columbia Association do manage larger pieces of property and do serve as representatives for individual residents and residential interests. In particular, we have noticed that the cost to participate in village elections has been slowly going up. This last year, there was significant cost, though when I first ran for a village board, 15 plus years ago, The entire election, which was contested, was me printing out a few flyers on my home computer and handing them out. Over the last 15 years, we've seen almost every candidate in a contested election have to do some mailing. Certainly, usually it's not these nice color flyers. It's usually postcards and things like that. We'd
Ms.
like to,
Basu, we'll have to ask you to wrap up, please.
so we're just asking to know what people are spending and where their funding is coming from.
Thank you. Next, Mark Fine for 2 minutes, please. I'm scanning. Is Mark Fine on here? Okay, we'll circle back. Morgan Drayton for 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair Atterbury, Vice Chair Washington, and members of the committee. My name is Morgan Drayton, Policy and Engagement Manager for Common Cause Maryland. Thank you for the opportunity to give testimony in support of HB 93, which aims to strengthen campaign finance reporting requirements for municipalities throughout the state, as well as establish similar processes for housing entities. And I'll try to keep my comments short since our sponsor did such a great job of covering the details of the bill. We think that this bill is needed because while many municipalities have reporting requirements for candidates, which are then posted by the SBE, we still get plenty of calls from members of the public who are confused why they aren't able to find reports for their specific city of residence. And that's because SBE doesn't currently report for municipalities that don't have codified reporting requirements. So HB 93 will address this confusion through this straightforward change that requires all municipal candidates to submit reports to SBE for publication. And we also know that developers spend a great deal of money influencing board races for condominiums, HOAs, and other housing corporations that wield significant power, and this bill would expand reporting requirements to cover those races. And while this isn't included in our written testimony, after internal discussion, we suggest requiring municipalities to send candidate filing deadlines, elections calendars to SBE as well. It'll make that easier on SBE staff to make all of that available to the public and make it overall easier to keep up with these races. So we believe that this is a straightforward bill that improves overall transparency in campaign finance laws. And with that, thank you, and we urge a favorable report.
That was 2 minutes on the dot. Thank you. Next, Joel Horwitz for 2 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, Chair Atterbury. Nice to see you, members of the committee, and my delegates, Eversole and Belmark from District 12. As Delegate Trasa explained, we have a problem last year in Columbia, which I assume my delegates are aware of, and I would support disclosure, but this bill has so many problems. First, combining the municipalities and the common ownership communities is just one of them. But the biggest problem to start with is the definition of election is defined in the election code, does not cover COCs. All that's mentioned in the bill are also a problem. In my village, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm on one of the village boards in Columbia. Each tenant gets a vote in addition to each lot owner. That is not something under the election law. It's also unclear which COCs have been covered. I've been talking to ones in Columbia and elsewhere. There seems no reason for the condos and the co-ops. There aren't any of 2,000, but it's become clear that they doesn't even cover apparently the way Montgomery Village and Leisure World are organized, nor do many of the villages in Columbia meet the 2,000 lot owner requirement, and only if you talked about members and not lot owners, which is something for the E&T committee, which seems that the HOA Act often seems to be imprecise in bouncing between the two languages. I don't believe the SBE understands the intricacies of homeowners association law. And to make it simple, as Delegate Trusser wants to file it, if the HOA does not make a rule structure, you have to get a campaign account, a treasurer, and just to file the affidavit to say that you spent $10. So that doesn't seem to work. And if you're going to apply this to all municipalities, those that are smaller than many HOAs with 65, 200, 500 people, it's going to be a chilling effect on them from the ones I've talked to.
Mr. Horowitz, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up your remarks.
All right. We need to cover independent expenditures, which is the biggest problem that happened in Columbia. And there are many problems with the effective date for the HOAs, municipalities, and for SBE to put regulations in place in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, for 2 minutes, Bob Enton.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Robert Enton on behalf of the Maryland Building Industry Association. And we are signed up favorable with amendments. I did have several conversations with the sponsor. The way the Maryland law works right now, when a developer is going to construct a community with condominiums, when a developer is going to develop a big plot of land, sell lots, you have homeowners association rules, legislation, and condo owner rules and legislation. And eventually those projects are going to be turned over to the owners. I've represented the builders, I guess, for maybe 20 years. I have never, ever, ever heard a single complaint or concern raised by anyone, including members of the General Assembly, members of the public, about contributions being given to condo association candidates or homeowners association candidates. All the testimony on this bill concerns the Columbia Association, where somebody did raise a very large amount of money. So we're signed up favorable with amendments. Our amendment would be, if there's a problem with the Columbia Association, which is a unique, in my experience, type of property, with huge commercial properties, all kinds of residential properties, condominiums, townhouses, individual homes, then amend the bill and make it apply to the Columbia Association. If there's ever a problem with condo associations or homeowners associations, and fine, bring it back. But we just don't think this legislation is appropriate for the types of projects that we build. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I see 2 questions. We'll start with Delegate Palkovich-Carr, and then I see Delegate Hornberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Delegate Terraza, for bringing this bill forward. I actually, before I came to the legislature, was one of these local elected officials. I was elected twice to city council and had to disclose this kind of report. And I actually do think that all local officials should need to. I had 2 quick questions for the bill sponsor. The first is, I appreciate that you addressed the concerns that the AG had listed in their testimony. And I think you mentioned that you had a couple of advice letters from the AG's office. And I'm wondering if you can actually just share those with the committee so we have that as part of the record for the bill.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry I didn't mention that, and I appreciate the question. I will share those as soon as I get off this. Yeah,
excellent. My other question is also for Delegate Terraza. Have you received any feedback from the state board about implementation for this? Have they expressed any concerns about implementing this bill?
So I will turn it over to Mr. Demarinis after this, but I think there's a little bit of confusion about how it will be implemented. The intent is not for the, because when I first looked into doing this, I went to Jared Demarinis and I said, I want you to track all of these different HOAs and all these cities, and for them to all report to you. And that seemed like that was going to be very complicated for him to have to understand how every HOA works, every city works, when all their deadlines are. And it became really apparent that that was not doable. So the idea is that they will either have to set up their own, or they'll have to follow the states exactly how it is with the deadlines the way they are. And that would be much less of a burden for Mr. Demarinis. But I should probably let him comment on that.
Yes, I mean, this bill would have a fiscal impact on us, especially, there would be computer changes. We would have to do some programming for the results, for the inputting of these election committees to file and to put the new reporting deadlines and tracking it. And then if there's failure to files, to send it over to the state prosecutor's office for enforcement for that. But as the delegate mentioned, right, if these HOAs or municipalities have their own rules, then what we would do is just receive the reports and then post them. And that's like almost like current practice with the ones that we have. So right now, for example, we receive the City of Annapolis's campaign finance reports. They just come in and we just then post them online. We do that with the City of Rockville, College Park. And so that part there because we're not enforcing it, we're not, monitoring it. We just get the rule, we just get the reports and post it for public disclosure, and make no, I would say, use any administrative, that would not be an administrative burden, but the other part would be. I mean, it would just have a fiscal impact.
Right.
Madam Chair, if I can ask just one brief follow-up question, if that's okay.
Yes.
Mr. Damaris, can you actually point to where folks can find those reports that are currently getting filed from those existing municipalities? I was trying to look for it and had trouble locating those.
Sure, it's on the MD Chris website there under disclosures. If you can see, it would be view municipal candidate documents. And you can just kind of select the municipality there and go forward with it. They're all there. So it's www.campaignfinance, all one word, .maryland.gov under disclosures, and they're there. And then they're all PDFs.
The other questions could just hold for a second. My apologies to Lori Graff. You have not testified. I called you on the completely wrong bill and then I forgot to call you. So I am very sorry. So please go ahead.
No worries, no worries. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Lori Graff. I'm the CEO of the Maryland Building Industry Association, and we are favorable with amendments. I don't have much to add. Mr. Etten touched on a lot of things I was going to mention. This is a statewide bill. We are not sure of the impact, and I do also want to thank the sponsor for taking some time to talk to me yesterday about it. We don't know exactly how many HOAs are in 2,000 or more, and it was mentioned before, there is probably no condos and no cooperatives that would be covered under this bill. Those are generally less than 2,000 units, but these are private entities. It's very, very challenging to get anyone to run for these board positions in most cases. So we're concerned about the impact of that, and would just like to, if there's a problem in Columbia, let's certainly address that, but I don't think it needs to be further than that. So with that, I have no further comments. Thank you.
Thank you, and my apologies again. Delegate Hornberger, then I see Delegate Lasanti and Delegate Feldmark. So Delegate Hornberger.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair. In a similar vein of what Ms. Graff had just alluded to, I represent 5 municipalities, and in 4 of those 5, we really struggle with folks to even run. Many times the elections are uncontested, and sometimes we have long-standing vacancies for these municipal elections. My fear is that this additional administrative burden would further curtail folks from running. Isn't it already mandatory for all municipal candidates that they have to file a financial disclosure?
Is that for me? Can I?
Either Jared or the other bill sponsor.
It is not. It is only the requirement in, I think I said 14 or 10. I can't remember. It's in my testimony. It's only in 12 out of 157 municipalities a requirement. So
for the financial disclosure, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so in terms of the difficulty, I am actually very sympathetic to that in terms, I mean, in HOAs, it's also the same thing, or COCs, it's also the same thing in terms of difficulty in getting people to run as well. I guess what I would say to that is for smaller cities that have, where there's not a lot of money going into those, what you would want to do is the same thing that I was talking about with the others, is just instead of having somebody have to get a treasurer and report to Mr. Demarinis, all their campaign finances, have them set up something where they just write it down, they send it in to the municipality, and then Mr. Demarinis gets a copy and it's available to everybody, just like they are in every other election.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So as a follow-up, I mean, I think that the financial disclosure is important. The tracking of expenditures and all that. I mean, in many of these cases, there are no expenditures. It's just someone putting their name on a ballot. I mean, I have towns of 700 people, 2 to 20 vote in the election. I just don't want to discourage anybody from getting involved, because many of us started at that level, and we don't want to discourage anyone at the onset. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, can I may have answered that question wrong. Financial disclosure in terms of, you mean an ethics, like that financial disclosure? I may have answered that wrong. I don't know the answer to that question. I was answering in terms of financial reporting, so I apologize.
Yeah, my understanding is that all the municipalities have to submit to their municipal government some sort of financial disclosure. Owned properties, residency, it can go much more detailed as some of these municipalities get larger, but that does give us a window into what their withholdings are and what they might be up to. And then in terms of the financial disclosures, we do have, if you are looking for parity at the state level, we do have the affidavits for $1,000 or less. So that might be some language that you could copy over, and that way those small tier candidates won't even have to get a treasurer. They just file the affidavit and go about their business.
Even in terms of the municipalities.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
That makes sense.
Delegate Lasanti.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the sponsor for bringing forward this bill. And certainly in our former lives on county councils, we understand how serious the issues become with HOAs and private associations, but they are very different throughout the state. Obviously, in Howard County, not having municipalities, you have larger homeowners associations, whereas in Harford County, Cecil County, some of the more rural areas, we have municipalities that really take on that responsibility. So I kind of see these as two different issues. A couple of questions just to dig down a little bit. As far as setting a threshold, and I'll take one of them at a time, for the municipalities, are you looking at a broad base, everybody, or are you thinking about adding some type of an amendment that sets a threshold for that, an expenditure threshold?
Well, MML had asked for a threshold, and I don't know if that's what Delegate Hornberger was suggesting, but if there's a threshold of 1,000 like we have in terms of an affidavit, that makes sense to me. I don't think that's what they were thinking.
Right.
Can I comment on the first piece though, in terms of the unit? And I appreciate that, I am definitely from a county that doesn't have municipalities. And I would be curious if you have the same, and I know I'm not supposed to be asking questions, so I can talk to you offline about that, but if you have those larger HOAs, because I don't believe you would have any that this would apply to. So that's why I set the threshold at 2,000.
2,000 units, right?
2,000 units, right.
Okay.
And I don't believe it applies to a lot of HO or COCs. And my guess is that what I didn't want it to do is apply to, like, so for example, in Columbia, I live in Columbia, but I also live in a 77 unit townhome community.
Right, right.
So I didn't want it to apply to something like that, because those 77 unit townhome communities, I mean, they're usually mostly concerned with citing people for violations of, I didn't paint my house, I didn't do whatever, they do grounds and all those other things, but it's a very different entity than a large HOA or a COC that's taking on more responsibility, running security, doing much larger infrastructure needs, et cetera.
I think it's an interesting concept as to also what the defined responsibility is of some of these larger HOAs. Are they acting as a quasi government? at that size. I mean, so that's really an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Another question, and just this may be a rhetorical question, but I've heard this come up for many years, and in other bills of testimony, is actual filing requirements for homeowners associations and condo associations in the state. I'm not aware that we have any database even of who manages most, if not all of, unless they're a large management company, who actually is responsible for the management of homeowners associations and condo associations.
So we deal with that in ENT, and there's been a bill. There's frequently a bill by Delegate Holmes.
Right, I remember.
To try to register homeowners associations the way they do, or I should say COCs. I'm so biased for HOAs.
That's okay.
Live in one, but it would be a great idea, which is probably beyond the scope of this committee's interest in conversing about, but we can talk about it. I think it's really important to be able to know where they all are and the sizes and what's going on with them and what functions they perform. I think it's really important.
I'm happy to talk to you offline, because I really do see these as companions. Is if we want transparency and we want disclosure.
I would agree with that. I mean, I support that too. It's just
all right. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Delegate Feldmark.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Delegate Terrassa, for this bill and your testimony, and especially the time that you've already spent with me one-on-one answering many of my questions. I just had one specific question sort of in response to some of the conversation today, and I'm not sure if this is just a piece I missed earlier. You discussed aligning the reporting schedules with the Board of Elections reporting schedule for sort of administrative ease, which I think makes a lot of sense. Does that mean you'd be aligning timing of elections also? Because that schedule is sort of about leading up to an election. And I'm not sure how that would work. So I just wanted to clarify.
I really appreciate the question. So that's my understanding of how it's drafted after my initial conversations with Mr. Demarinis. It's certainly not ideal for an HOA, for example, that has I don't know when all the municipalities have their elections, and I'd certainly be interested to find out if they're all timed at all closely with our election, with the other elections. But the idea was to have them follow our reporting requirements with our timing, which is not ideal if they don't want to pass their own rules. So really, my goal is for localities to be passing their own rules and not burdening I've drafted it so as to not burden SBE with having to figure out what all those different COCs were doing. And to the extent that municipalities have that variety, they wouldn't have to track those either. So yeah, it's not ideal for them to have to follow our election requirements, but the only other way to do that is to require them to do this. And I saw that as more onerous on cities and HOAs. So we left open this option that they could follow something that is less informative to the voter, right? It's a little less informative to the voter. It's informative to get the information, but it's less timely if they're doing it on our reporting schedule, if that makes sense. But it still gives them the freedom, which is what I sort of opted for.
Thank you.
Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I would quite, if they're allowed to establish their own sort of deadlines and that sort of thing, first of all, who monitors that? Do they self-monitor? And if they do, who like there's enforcement at the state level. If you don't do it, you can be removed as a candidate. Do they do their own enforcement then also? Okay, well, that makes sense. Do you think generally, there's some experience with Columbia that reporting these expenditures is going to tamp down the number of people who would be interested, or would make it much more difficult for them, or do you think it would pretty much make it a little more transparent? Which way would that transparency be too costly? Is kind of the question.
I think can I send that over to Ms. Basu? I think she has some thoughts on that. I think what I tried to do was make this so that it could be as simple a process as possible, so as not to discourage people. And my concern was large money coming into these elections without transparency would be discouraging. But I don't know if Ms. Basu has any, and is that okay, Madam Chair, if we?
Yes, Ms. Basu, do you want to comment?
Sure. So our village board has not come up with what our 2 sheets of paper would look like from a candidate standpoint. And as someone who desperately tries to get people involved in Columbia, if the process is easy enough where Delegate Terrassa says, here is where the money is coming from and here is what it's being spent on, that is no more difficult than getting 10 signatures and attending a couple of board meetings and getting that paperwork in to file for candidacy.
Which is already required.
Which is already required. What we're seeing in Long Reach is, and in some other villages, is fear on the part of new candidates about how much of my own money am I going to have to put into this race. 6,000 households is a lot of households to mail. And for most of us, this is a volunteer position. We've seen large money come in, but it's not just large money. There are folks who are feeling like they have to go to their neighbors and have to go to allies to get $100 here, $500 there, or even donations of stamps to try to mail the entire village, which I understand is fine. That's a type of speech, but as voters, we should know where that money is coming from and how much is being spent.
Just one more follow-up, if I may, Madam Chair. Do you concern yourself that an HOA might have a group of people who made the restrictions so difficult that it would discourage the average person from running because the requirements would be so great? In other words, instead of creating more relaxed ones to encourage people in, but still have some transparency, create ones that would be difficult for the average person to manage. Is that a consideration?
Can I answer?
It's kind of a follow-up for Nina, but
if
Delegate Terrassa, that'd be good for you too.
Can I answer that also? Like, they can do that now. I mean, nothing prevents them from today setting up onerous rules for candidacy in an HOA. They can do it today. This just requires that reporting to be done either by them or by the state, or by the state. I mean, in other words, a candidate to either file with them, or if they don't set up something, then it goes to the state. They can already set up their own requirements to make it really difficult to run if they want to, which I hope they wouldn't.
It's a helpful answer. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Delegate Terrassa, I appreciate all of your work on this bill. You clearly had a lot of conversations and really worked to ensure that it could be as streamlined as possible. I just have a baseline question to make sure that I understand, because I know there have been a number of questions and perhaps some suggestions on amendments. In terms of I just want to confirm, in terms of the municipalities, you're proposing would apply to all municipalities, no spend minimum. In terms of the COCs, I think you said 2,000 units or more, no spend minimum as well. I just want to confirm what
that is
applying to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're fine.
So that is the proposal. I think the municipalities were asking for a spend minimum, and I would be open to that. I think that the 25,000 that they're proposing to me is much too high. I'm certainly open to that discussion. I think 1,000 makes a lot more sense. But certainly the subcommittee could discuss that, and I'd be open to it. But my bill does not have a spend minimum.
Are there any further questions for the bill sponsor or any of the witnesses? Seeing none, thank you very much, Delegate Terrassa. That concludes the bill hearing on House Bill 93, and it concludes the Ways and Means bill hearings today. We will be back together to resume bill hearings tomorrow at 1 p.m. No briefings tomorrow. And right now, I need all of the folks going to back room to hop off this link and get on your new link. So I will see